In the quiet streets of a typical suburban neighborhood, nobody suspected that a deadly secret was unfolding just behind closed doors. Susan Harper, a 40-year-old housewife, found herself in a dangerous relationship with Matthew Rogers, the 21-year-old son of her neighbors. What started as a risky affair quickly spiraled out of control, and no one could have predicted how tragically it would end. Susan's marriage to Mark, her husband of 15 years, had become routine and dull. She felt trapped in her own home, longing for excitement. Matthew, young and full of energy, was looking for a thrill. Their paths crossed often, and eventually temptation got the best of them. What seemed like harmless fun soon took a darker turn, as lies began to stack up and guilt crept in. As the affair deepened, so did the tension. Matthew was carefree, but Susan was growing increasingly paranoid about being discovered. She knew her perfect life could crumble if the truth ever got out. Yet, despite the risks, they continued to meet in secret, believing they could keep their relationship hidden forever. However, someone else had noticed, and the walls were closing in fast. The neighborhood, once calm and peaceful, would soon become the backdrop for a chilling crime that no one could have seen coming. Behind the pleasant smiles and neatly trimmed lawns, betrayal was festering, and things were about to take a violent turn. What began as a way for Susan to escape her unhappy life ended in heartbreak, destruction, and the ultimate crime. It all started in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where every house looked alike, and everyone seemed to know each other's business. Susan Harper lived in one of those houses, a 40-year-old housewife married to Mark Harper, who spent most of his days working and coming home late. Susan's life appeared perfect from the outside, with her beautiful home, 2 children in school, and a husband who provided for the family. But on the inside, she felt lonely and unfulfilled. Mark had become distant over the years, his focus on work making their marriage feel more like a routine than a relationship. Susan tried to fill the void with hobbies, spending time with friends, and taking care of her home, but nothing seemed to give her the excitement she longed for. That's when she met Matthew Rogers, her neighbor's 21-year-old son. He had recently returned home after finishing college and was spending his days lounging around the neighborhood, looking for work and passing the time. Matthew was young, confident, and full of energy, the complete opposite of Susan's withdrawn husband. They would exchange small talk whenever they crossed paths, but it wasn't long before the casual conversations turned into something more. Susan felt a spark with Matthew that she hadn't felt in years, and for Matthew, the idea of having a secret relationship with an older woman excited him. It started innocently, with Susan offering Matthew small favors and lunches, but soon the flirtation became undeniable. They began meeting more often in secret, stealing moments when no one was around. The affair was thrilling for both of them, and for a while they convinced themselves that it was just harmless fun. Susan knew it was wrong, but the excitement of sneaking around with Matthew made her feel alive again. She hadn't felt this way in years, and she didn't want it to end. But things took a dark turn when someone else in the neighborhood noticed their secret meetings. A neighbor, who had been watching Susan and Matthew from afar, had grown suspicious. The neighbor saw them together too often, in places they shouldn't have been, at times when Mark wasn't home. At first they kept the information to themselves, but the more they saw, the more they felt they needed to act. They began to think about how to reveal Susan's affair to Mark without causing too much drama in the neighborhood. Unaware that their secret was at risk, Susan and Matthew continued their affair. The guilt began to eat at Susan, though. She loved her family and knew that if Mark found out, everything she had built would fall apart. Matthew, on the other hand, wasn't as concerned. He didn't have as much to lose, and he was enjoying the thrill too much to stop. As the affair continued, Susan started becoming paranoid, always looking over her shoulder, afraid someone might have seen them together. One day, the neighbor who had been watching Susan finally decided to act. They wrote an anonymous letter to Mark, detailing what they had seen between his wife and Matthew. They described their secret meetings, the times when Mark wasn't home, and even where they had seen them together. The letter was sent anonymously to Mark's work address, ensuring Susan wouldn't intercept it. When Mark received the letter, his world turned upside down. At first, he didn't want to believe it. Susan had always been a loving wife and mother, and he couldn't imagine her being involved with someone, especially someone as young as Matthew. But the details in the letter were too specific to ignore. Mark decided to confront Susan about the affair, but he wanted to gather more proof before doing so. He began watching her closely, paying attention to her comings and goings and trying to catch her in the act. He even confronted Matthew casually, trying to gauge his reactions to simple questions. Mark's behavior became more erratic as his suspicions grew, but Susan didn't notice. She was too wrapped up in her own guilt and the thrill of the affair to see that her husband was starting to unravel. Eventually, Mark couldn't take it anymore. After a particularly long day at work, he came home early, determined to catch Susan and Matthew together. When he walked into the house, he found Susan sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale as she tried to explain the situation. Mark's rage was uncontrollable. He had suspected something, but hearing the truth from Susan shattered him. He couldn't believe that the woman he had built a life with had been sneaking around with their neighbor's son. Susan pleaded with Mark to forgive her, saying that the affair was a mistake, but the damage was already done. Mark's anger grew as he thought about all the times he had trusted her, all the moments she had lied to his face. He stormed out of the house, heading straight to Matthew's home next door. When Mark confronted Matthew, the situation escalated quickly. Mark's fury, mixed with Matthew's arrogance, led to a violent confrontation. Mark accused Matthew of ruining his marriage, of taking advantage of his wife. Matthew, feeling invincible in the moment, didn't back down. Words turned into physical aggression, and before long, a scuffle broke out between the two men. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Mark struck Matthew, not intending to kill him, but the blow was fatal. Matthew collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The neighborhood, once quiet and peaceful, was now the scene of a murder. Mark stood over Matthew's body in shock, realizing what he had just done. In a matter of moments, his life had crumbled. The police were called, and an investigation quickly began. Susan, now left with the weight of her actions, was in complete despair. The affair that had once made her feel alive had led to death, betrayal, and the destruction of everything she once held dear. Detective Sarah Williams, assigned to the case, was tasked with unraveling the events that led to Matthew's death. As she pieced together the story, it became clear that this was not just a crime of passion, but the result of a series of poor decisions, lies, and hidden secrets. The investigation brought to light the darkest parts of this suburban neighborhood, showing that even in the quietest places, tragedy can strike when least expected. As the days went on, Susan Harper's guilt about her affair with Matthew Rogers deepened. Her perfect suburban life was starting to feel like a fragile house of cards, one wrong move from collapsing. She tried to carry on as if nothing was wrong, keeping up appearances for the neighbors and her family, but the weight of her secret relationship with Matthew was always on her mind. Every interaction with her husband Mark became more strained. She began to avoid eye contact, and even the smallest questions from Mark made her heart race, fearing he might suspect something. Despite the guilt, the affair with Matthew continued. Susan felt torn between the excitement and the deep shame she carried. Matthew, who was younger and carefree, didn't share the same concern. He saw their relationship as nothing more than a fun escape and was willing to take more risks. They would meet in secret whenever Mark was at work or when Susan's children were at school. Each encounter, while thrilling, chipped away at Susan's sense of security. One afternoon, while Mark was away on a work trip, Susan and Matthew met again. This time their meeting was different. They were in her home, and for the first time they didn't rush. They acted as though they had all the time in the world. This boldness would come back to haunt Susan. She hadn't realized that one of her neighbors, an older woman who lived across the street, had been watching them. The neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, had always been the curious type, and over the past few weeks, she had noticed a pattern between Susan and the young man next door. She had seen them together in places they shouldn't be at times when Mark wasn't home, and her suspicions grew stronger by the day. Mrs. Anderson began watching them closely. That day, she watched from behind her curtains as Susan let Matthew into the house. She saw the way they behaved around each other, how they were too comfortable for it to be just a friendly visit. She knew something was going on, and it didn't take her long to decide what to do. Mrs. Anderson didn't want to be the one to confront Susan, but she also didn't want to keep the secret. Instead, she decided to send an anonymous letter to Mark. The letter wasn't long. It simply stated that something was going on between his wife and the neighbor's son. She included details about the time she had seen them together and the places where she had noticed them acting suspiciously. The letter arrived at Mark's office, and when he opened it, his world shattered. At first, Mark didn't want to believe it. He had always trusted Susan, and the idea that she could betray him with someone so young and close to their family seemed impossible. But as he reread the letter, the details gnawed at him. It was too specific to be a lie. Mark didn't confront Susan immediately. Instead, he began paying closer attention to her behavior. He started coming home earlier than usual, watching for any signs that the letter might be true. He noticed how distant Susan had become, how she avoided his questions and seemed nervous. It wasn't long before he began to put the pieces together. Mark's suspicions grew stronger, but he needed proof before he could confront her. Meanwhile, Susan had no idea that her husband had received the letter. She continued her secret meetings with Matthew, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, but she convinced herself that it was just paranoia. As their affair continued, she found it harder to focus on anything else. Her family, her responsibilities, even her friendships started to suffer as her mind became consumed with fear and guilt. One evening, Mark came home earlier than expected. He didn't announce his arrival, hoping to catch Susan off guard. As he walked into the house, he saw Susan in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her head in her hands. She didn't notice him at first, and he took a moment to observe her, trying to see if he could read the truth on her face. When Susan finally looked up, the tension between them was palpable. Mark asked her where she had been that day, but she stumbled over her words, unable to give a straight answer. Mark's patience snapped. He had hoped that Susan would confess, that she would come clean and admit to what she had done, but when she didn't, his anger boiled over. Without thinking, he stormed out of the house and headed straight to the Rogers home. His emotions were a volatile mix of rage and betrayal, and he wasn't thinking clearly. All he wanted was answers. He pounded on the door until Matthew opened it, his casual demeanor only infuriating Mark more. The confrontation between Mark and Matthew escalated quickly. Mark accused Matthew of betraying his trust, of taking advantage of Susan. Matthew, who had always been brash and confident, didn't back down. He saw Mark as just another obstacle, someone who stood in the way of his fun. Words turned to threats, and before long, the situation spiraled out of control. In a moment of blind rage, Mark lashed out. What started as a heated argument quickly turned into a physical altercation. Neither man had intended for things to go so far, but once the fight began, it was impossible to stop. Mark, fueled by his anger, struck Matthew with a force that neither of them had anticipated. The blow was fatal. Matthew crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Mark stood frozen, staring down at what he had done. The gravity of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. He had just killed a young man, someone who, despite everything, didn't deserve to die. The reality of his actions washed over him as he knelt beside Matthew's body, his hands trembling. Mark hadn't intended to kill him, but it was too late. The damage was done. Susan, who had followed Mark out of the house, arrived just in time to see the aftermath. She stood in shock as she saw Matthew lying on the ground, lifeless, and her husband standing over him, his face a mix of rage and disbelief. She wanted to scream, to run, to do something, anything, but all she could do was stand frozen in place, the world crashing down around her. The police were called, and the once quiet neighborhood was now the scene of a murder investigation. Detective Sarah Williams, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving even the most complex cases, arrived at the scene. As she surveyed the situation, she knew this was not just a simple case of a lover's quarrel gone wrong. There was more to the story, and it was her job to uncover the truth. As the investigation began, the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together. The affair, the anonymous letter, the confrontation, and the fatal blow, all of it led to one tragic conclusion. What had started as a secret relationship meant to fill a void in Susan's life had spiraled out of control, ending in death and devastation. Now Mark faced the consequences of his actions, and Susan was left to pick up the shattered remains of her life. The quiet suburban neighborhood would never be the same. The aftermath of the confrontation between Mark and Matthew was nothing short of a tragedy. Matthew's lifeless body lay on the ground, and the reality of what had just happened was overwhelming for everyone involved. Susan stood frozen, her mind spinning, unable to comprehend how everything had unraveled so quickly. The guilt, the fear, the disbelief, they all collided at once. Mark, still trembling from the altercation, knew that his life would never be the same again. Soon after, the police arrived at the scene. The quiet suburban street was transformed into a crime scene, with yellow tape surrounding the area, neighbors peeking out from behind their curtains, watching as investigators swarmed the scene. Detective Sarah Williams, known for her sharp instincts and no-nonsense approach, took charge of the case. She had seen her fair share of crimes, but there was something particularly unsettling about this one. Mark was taken into custody without resistance, too shocked to process what had happened. He hadn't planned to kill Matthew, it had been a moment of blind rage. Still, the law didn't care about intentions, it cared about actions, and Mark had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. He sat in the back of the police car, staring blankly out the window, while Susan was questioned by officers, her face pale and her body trembling with fear. Detective Williams wasted no time. She began piecing together the events leading up to the murder. The first step was to interview everyone involved. She started with Susan, who, despite her emotional state, had no choice but to cooperate. Susan recounted her affair with Matthew, her growing guilt, and the anonymous letter that had triggered everything. She admitted to the affair, but it was clear that her confession wouldn't absolve her from the blame she felt. This was her mess, and now it had led to a death she couldn't have foreseen. As Susan described the relationship, Detective Williams took note of the details: the secret meetings, the tension between Susan and her husband, and the growing distance in their marriage. She could see how everything had spiraled out of control. However, Detective Williams was more interested in Mark's perspective. While Susan's affair had undoubtedly fueled the confrontation, it was Mark who had delivered the fatal blow. The detective needed to understand why things had escalated to this point. Mark, still in shock, was brought in for questioning. His story was straightforward, but it didn't excuse his actions. He explained how he had received the anonymous letter and how it had shattered his trust in Susan. He spoke about his growing suspicions and his desire to catch her in the act. But when he confronted Matthew, things had quickly spiraled out of control. The anger he had bottled up for so long had finally exploded, and in a moment of fury, he had struck Matthew harder than he intended. Detective Williams listened carefully, but she knew that Mark's account, while tragic, wouldn't change the fact that he had killed someone. The investigation continued as the forensic team processed the crime scene. They collected evidence, took photographs, and analyzed the physical altercation between Mark and Matthew. Everything pointed to a crime of passion, a sudden, impulsive act driven by raw emotion. However, there was one piece of the puzzle that still didn't fit: the anonymous letter. Who had sent it, and why? Detective Williams couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple case of a love triangle gone wrong. Someone had been watching, and someone had decided to intervene by sending that letter to Mark. But who? And what were their intentions? Determined to uncover the truth, Detective Williams expanded the investigation to include the neighbors. She started with Mrs. Anderson, the nosy neighbor who lived across the street from Susan and Mark. Mrs. Anderson was known for keeping tabs on everyone in the neighborhood, always watching and gossiping about the latest happenings. When Detective Williams knocked on her door, Mrs. Anderson wasn't surprised. She had been expecting the police to show up at some point. During the interview, Mrs. Anderson admitted that she had seen Susan and Matthew together on multiple occasions. She had grown suspicious of their relationship and had decided to take matters into her own hands by sending the anonymous letter. Mrs. Anderson claimed she had done it out of concern for Mark, but there was something about her demeanor that made Detective Williams question her motives. Was it really concern, or was there something more sinister at play? As the investigation continued, Detective Williams began to unravel a web of lies and deceit that went deeper than anyone had anticipated. Mrs. Anderson's involvement raised more questions than answers. While her actions had indirectly led to the confrontation between Mark and Matthew, the letter alone wasn't enough to explain the violent outcome. There had to be more to the story. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzzed with rumors and speculation. People whispered about the affair, the murder, and the anonymous letter. Some sympathized with Mark, believing he had been pushed to his breaking point. Others condemned him for taking a life, no matter the circumstances. As the days passed, the media picked up the story, turning it into a sensation. Reporters swarmed the area, and Mark's face was plastered on the news, portrayed as both a victim and a criminal. For Susan, the weight of everything became unbearable. She struggled with the guilt of her affair and the knowledge that her actions had set the chain of events in motion. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and couldn't face the reality of what had happened. The love she had once felt for Matthew was now overshadowed by the overwhelming sense of responsibility for his death. In her mind, she had destroyed her family, her marriage, and an innocent life. Back at the police station, Detective Williams continued to dig deeper into the lives of everyone involved. She discovered that Matthew had been reckless in more ways than one. His carefree attitude and lack of responsibility had caused problems in the past, and his relationship with Susan was just one example of his impulsive behavior. However, this didn't excuse Mark's actions, and the detective knew that the case would soon be handed over to the district attorney for prosecution. Mark was charged with manslaughter, and the case was prepared for trial. His defense attorney argued that it had been a crime of passion, that Mark had acted in the heat of the moment, driven by the shock of discovering his wife's affair. The prosecution, on the other hand, painted a picture of a man who had allowed his anger to turn into violence, ultimately leading to Matthew's death. The trial was a media spectacle, with reporters covering every detail. Susan was called to testify, and she recounted the affair, the guilt, and the moment when everything had come crashing down. She was emotionally drained, and her testimony was heartbreaking, but it didn't change the fact that her husband had killed someone. In the end, the jury found Mark guilty of manslaughter. While the sentence was less severe than murder, he still faced years in prison for his actions. The verdict left the neighborhood divided. Some believed that justice had been served, while others felt that Mark's punishment didn't fit the crime. As for Susan, she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. Her marriage was over, her reputation destroyed, and the guilt of Matthew's death weighed heavily on her shoulders. She moved out of the neighborhood, unable to face the people who had once been her friends. The affair that had started as an escape from her mundane life had ended in tragedy, and she would never be the same. Detective Williams closed the case, but the impact of the events lingered. The quiet suburban street that had once seemed so perfect was now marked by the memory of a life lost, a family torn apart, and the dark secrets that had been hidden behind closed doors. The day of the trial arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. Mark sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of exhaustion and regret. The reality of the situation weighed heavily on him. His actions had led to the death of a man, and now his life was in the hands of the court. Across the room, Susan sat, her own face pale and drawn. The affair had not only destroyed her marriage, but had also cost Matthew his life. As the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time painting a picture of a man who had let his emotions get the better of him. They focused on the moments leading up to the confrontation, the anonymous letter that had pushed Mark over the edge, and the intense rage that had driven him to commit murder. They argued that while Mark may not have planned to kill Matthew, his actions were deliberate and reckless, and they demanded justice for the life that had been lost. The defense, on the other hand, portrayed Mark as a man pushed to his breaking point. They argued that the letter had been the final blow in an already strained marriage, and that Mark's confrontation with Matthew had been fueled by a sense of betrayal. They emphasized that the fight had escalated unexpectedly, and that Mark had not intended for things to end the way they did. It was, they claimed, a tragic accident, a crime of passion. Throughout the trial, Susan was called to testify. Her testimony was emotional, as she recounted the details of her affair with Matthew and the guilt she felt for the role she had played in the tragedy. She described how the relationship had started as a brief escape from her crumbling marriage, but had quickly spiraled into something she could no longer control. She admitted that she had been wrong to betray her husband, but she never imagined that things would end in such a horrific way. As Susan spoke, Detective Williams, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, listened intently. Something still didn't sit right with her. She had followed every lead in the case, but there were details that remained unresolved. Most notably, the anonymous letter. She had already interviewed Mrs. Anderson, who had admitted to sending it, but Detective Williams couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. After Susan's testimony, the prosecution called Mrs. Anderson to the stand. She reiterated that she had sent the letter out of concern for Mark, but as she spoke, her tone seemed almost rehearsed. Detective Williams watched closely, her instincts telling her that there was something more beneath the surface. During cross-examination, Mrs. Anderson's story began to unravel. Under pressure from the defense attorney, she hesitated, her answers becoming vague and inconsistent. The defense seized the opportunity, pointing out that Mrs. Anderson had a history of meddling in her neighbor's affairs, and that her motivations for sending the letter were far from innocent. They suggested that she had been driven by jealousy and spite, not concern. As the trial continued, the truth about Mrs. Anderson began to emerge. Detective Williams had dug deeper into her background and discovered a history of manipulation and deceit. Mrs. Anderson had been watching Susan and Matthew for months, and her decision to send the letter had not been a spontaneous act of concern, it had been a calculated move to stir up trouble. She had been jealous of Susan's relationship with Matthew and wanted to see it destroyed. This revelation changed the entire tone of the trial. While it didn't absolve Mark of his actions, it shed new light on the events that had led to Matthew's death. The defense argued that Mrs. Anderson's interference had been the catalyst for the confrontation, and that without her involvement, the situation might never have escalated to the point of violence. The jury was left to decide whether Mark's actions had been a crime of passion or something more deliberate. The prosecution pushed for a guilty verdict, arguing that no matter the circumstances, Mark had taken a life and should be held accountable. The defense, however, asked the jury to consider the emotional turmoil Mark had been in and to show leniency in their judgment. As the jury deliberated, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Susan sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the floor, while Mark stared straight ahead, waiting for the verdict that would determine the rest of his life. Detective Williams, meanwhile, continued to piece together the events in her mind. She had uncovered the truth about Mrs. Anderson, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there were still unanswered questions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned with their verdict. Mark was found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The jury had been swayed by the defense's argument that Mark had acted in the heat of the moment, driven by overwhelming emotions and the betrayal he felt. While the conviction was still serious, it carried a lighter sentence than a murder charge, and Mark was sentenced to several years in prison. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the case, but it left a trail of shattered lives in its wake. Susan, overwhelmed with guilt and grief, filed for divorce and left the neighborhood, unable to face the people who knew the details of her affair and the tragedy it had caused. Mark, meanwhile, began his prison sentence, burdened by the knowledge that his actions had taken a life and destroyed his family. As for Mrs. Anderson, her reputation in the neighborhood was ruined. The truth about her manipulations had come to light, and she was shunned by the very people she had once gossiped with. She moved away, leaving behind a legacy of lies and deceit. Detective Williams closed the case, but the experience stayed with her. She had seen many tragedies in her career, but this one stood out because of the way it had been fueled by secrets, lies, and unchecked emotions. The quiet suburban neighborhood where it all had unfolded would never be the same again. The tragedy served as a stark reminder of the consequences of betrayal, jealousy, and impulsive decisions. A family was torn apart, a life was lost, and an entire community was left grappling with the aftermath. While the legal system had delivered its verdict, the emotional scars left behind would take far longer to heal. The tension in the house had grown unbearable. The once quiet home, now a battlefield of secrets and lies, was a ticking time bomb. The neighbor's son had become increasingly unstable, consumed by the guilt of his actions and the forbidden relationship he had entered into. He had been avoiding his friends, staying away from his usual hangouts, and becoming more paranoid with each passing day. The housewife, on the other hand, was living a double life caught between the duties of her family and the lustful affair she couldn't end. On the day everything came crashing down, something snapped. The son, fueled by anger and confusion, began texting her repeatedly, demanding to meet and talk about the future. He couldn't live in the shadows anymore. His messages were filled with frustration, anger, and desperation. She ignored him at first, hoping it would go away, but deep down she knew there was no escaping what she had set in motion. That evening, as she prepared dinner for her family, there was a knock at the door. Her heart raced, knowing it could only be one person. She opened the door slightly, and there he stood, visibly shaken. He forced his way inside, pleading with her to leave everything and run away with him. He couldn't stand being second anymore. But she knew this was impossible. She had a family, a reputation, and responsibilities she couldn't abandon. The conversation escalated. Words turned into shouts. The tension between them reached its boiling point. He was determined to have her, and she was determined to end the affair for good. In a fit of rage, he grabbed a kitchen knife. The moment seemed to stretch on forever as they locked eyes, both knowing what was about to happen. In a swift and tragic motion, the knife found its target, and the woman collapsed to the floor. The house was eerily silent for a few moments, the only sound being the ticking of the kitchen clock. Panic set in as the reality of what he had done washed over him. He dropped the knife and fled, leaving her lifeless body on the floor, blood pooling around her. The young man ran through the neighborhood, aimless and lost, trying to process what he had just done. Meanwhile, the family returned home to find a scene that would haunt them forever.